Hello, I'm Krista West of Avlea Folk Embroidery, and in this how-to video, I'm going to show you how to make a wall hanging with your embroidery. Let's start by gathering our tools. You're going to want your embroidery. You're going to want some lining fabric. For this project, I'm using Essex cotton linen. You're going to want a tapestry rod. If you've purchased an Avlea tapestry rod, it comes with black floss to make the braided cord to hang your wall hanging, but you can also use leftover floss from your kit. You're going to want a pair of scissors, a seam gauge, a chopstick, that's for turning corners, a mini awl. I really like these. These are the little Avlea mini awl. These are great for pulling drawn threads when we go to trim. A seam ripper, and some pins. You don't need very many, but a few are helpful. You are also going to want some kind of ironing setup. Here I'm using the Oliso Mini Project Iron and the new Oliso Multi-Mats. This is a wool mat that I can press so I can actually do my pressing on the table. And that is what you want to make sure you have gathered together. And in the next step, we will trim our embroidery. To trim our embroidery, we need to start first by pulling a thread channel. On even weave fabrics, this is important so that you get a very crisp, clean cutting line. So what I've done is I've used my little mini awl, right here, the little mini awl, and I have marked out 2 inches on the bottom. I have marked out 2 inches on each side, like that, and pulled a thread. And that's great because that's going to give me 1.5 inches of visible fabric and 1/2 inch for my seam allowance on each side and on the bottom. But at the top end of our embroidery, we need more finishing allowance because we're going to need to sew a casing for the tapestry rod to go through. So on the top edge, I am going to allow 3.5 inches. And here's how I'm going to do that. I'm going to measure out 3.5 inches like this, and I'm going to then use my mini awl to pick up a thread carefully, and I just pick up 1 thread like this. And actually, I don't feel like I got that entire thread there. The whole thread. And now, once I have that thread on my mini awl, I'm going to pull carefully. I like to pull from the center outwards and go like this, rather than from one side. And that is going to give me my trim line. If you have purchased an Avlea kit that is shown finished as a wall hanging, like this design, Alarian scroll and leaf will be, then I will allow you enough finishing allowance on either end for the casing. So what does that mean? That means that you don't have to figure out which side is going to be your casing side at the beginning. You'll still follow the instructions in the kit, do a center start. Because if I know that you need 3.5 inches on this side for the casing, I will also allow you 3.5 inches on this other side so that you're not having to balance exactly where to put your embroidery before you're finishing. You'll have the option of choosing either end to put your casing in. So once we've done that, we've pulled a thread on all 4 sides, and now we simply trim our embroidery along those thread channels, like this. And you're just going to very carefully trim along that thread channel. Now I'm going to do that on all 4 sides. Once I have trimmed my embroidery, I like to give it a light press. It helps to just smooth things out a little bit before this next step. Once I have it trimmed, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it and put it right sides together on my lining fabric and use my embroidery to trim my lining fabric to the exact same size as my embroidery. Once I have that done, I am now going to mark where my opening is going to be. Because what we're going to do in the next step is we're going to sew around the entire perimeter of this embroidery to sew the lining to the embroidery. But we have to leave an opening to be able to turn it inside out. So that's where the pins come in. I typically like to leave about a 4-inch opening on an embroidery of this size. And so I would put a pin probably right about there. And then using my seam gauge set at 4 inches, I would put another pin here. And I know that I need to not sew between that opening. Now, if it makes you feel more comfortable, you can also pin here. I find that the linens kind of stick to each other, so it really isn't too bad. But you can put some more pins around to hold it all in place while you either take it to the sewing machine or you sew this perimeter by hand. So now that I have that opening marked and I've pinned it to keep the lining fabric to the embroidery, I am then going to go to my machine and I'm going to sew the entire perimeter, leaving this part open. I'm going to sew all the way around it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I recently learned a new trick for making your opening turn a little cleaner. And what you want to do with that is you actually want to sew, let's see if I can point this out. You want to actually sew this way and create a 90-degree angle and then start your 1/2 inch seam allowance here. This area here, if you sew this little bit of seam, it's going to basically make your opening turn a little more cleanly. I've sewn my entire perimeter with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around, leaving this opening up here 4 inches. Now I need to do what's called grading the corners, and that means taking some of the bulk out of the corners. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to gently trim out that corner bulk like this, and I'm going to do that on all 4 sides like that. And then I am going to turn my embroidery inside out through that opening. So I'm going to find my 4 inch opening and I'm now going to turn my embroidery inside out. You want to be kind of gentle in this process because you're working with an even weave fabric. They tend to fray more. And so you're just gently turning it inside out. I like to just get it kind of turned inside out first like this. I'm not worrying about crisp corners or anything at this point. I just want to get it turned inside out. Then I usually put my hand in here and then I kind of like push out the seams and I push out the corners just with my fingers first, because if you do it with your fingers first, you're not going to actually poke through any threads. So I'm doing that on all 4 corners like that. Okay. And then once I've done that, now is the time in which I want to actually get in there with a chopstick. So now I take my trusty chopstick and I'm going to go in and I'm now going to work the corners out a little bit more. And what that's going to look like is like this. I am slowly working from each end and I'm kind of twisting the chopstick slightly. I don't know why I do that, but I do. It just seems to help, and I'm trying to ease that corner out as much as I can. And I'm gonna then the other thing I'm doing is you can notice, you can actually kind of see that with the light where you can see the chopstick in here. I'm taking the chopstick and I'm kind of striking the seam like this to kind of get it to not roll too much, because one of the things with working with heavier weight even weave fabrics is they kind of want to have a lot of the fabric kind of stuck in the seam allowance, and you've got to get that out. So we're going to pull it that way. Terrific. Now I'm going to put my chopstick in on the other side and do the same thing up here, like this. So I have all my corners turned, and now I need to start pressing. And I like to press from the back, and I usually start on the edge that does not have the opening. Leave the opening for last. Start on the edge that has the opening, and what you're going to do, get this a little closer, is you are going to slightly roll that lining fabric to the back as you're ironing. So you're just very slightly rolling that ironing fabric to the back and kind of working in really gentle little motions, and you're feeling to make sure that seam allowance is coming out like that. And you're going to do that all the way around the entire piece. Once you've pressed the perimeter, you have this little opening left. And I like to take that in 2 passes. So what I mean by that is I tend to actually pull back the lining a bit and I press the linen, the even weave fabric first, like this, so that I can make sure I'm getting a nice clean line on the other side. And then I press the lining fabric kind of separately. And that gives me a pretty clean finish. And once I've done that, I am now going to blind stitch that opening closed with just basic sewing thread. Here's how to blind stitch that opening closed. I'm using a sharp embroidery needle. This is just a size 7 embroidery needle. Any sewing needle works. And I'm using some of our Aurifil sewing thread. This is my favorite thread for hand sewing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by making what's called a tailor's tack. And I'm pushing this through. I have not put a knot in the thread. And I have just one length of thread there. And I'm pulling it through like that. And then what I'm doing is I am actually going to take one little stitch like this, and be very careful. Do not pull this through very much because it wants to come out. And then I'm going to take a second stitch, and that is going to actually hold the first one in place. And this is a way of making a knot, of securing your thread without actually making a knot. And if I feel like it isn't secure enough, sometimes I take a third pass just to make sure that it's really secure. Like that. You want to give it a little good tug, and if it holds, you're good. Now, to blind stitch, all you're going to do is you're going to now hold your embroidery like this, and you're going to come and pick up a few threads on the lining side, and you can pull those through, and then you're going to pick up a few threads on the embroidery side, like that. And then you're going to pick up a few more threads on the lining side, like that. I typically work these about 1/8 of an inch apart, 1/8 of an inch long, really. Few threads on the embroidery side, like that. Okay, and then a few threads on the lining side, like that. And then a few threads on the embroidery side. As you're working these, you can start out working them with fairly loose tension, and then once you get about 1 inch of them worked, that's when you can kind of start snugging them up a little bit. And you're going to do that all the way across until the opening is closed. Now it's time to sew our casing. And the way we're going to do that is we notice that one end, this is the end that is not the casing end, and one end has more fabric. That's the casing end. We're going to turn it, and what I'm going to do is at the sewing machine, I am going to sew a 1/2 inch seam this way across, and then another seam about 1.25 inches down from that, inch to 1.25 inches. I like my casings to have a little bit of extra room. So again, a 1/2 inch here, and then 1.25 inches beyond that 1/2 inch. So the first one's at a 1/2 inch, and the second one is 1 3/4 inches down from the raw edge. So I'll do that and show you that in the next step. So I'm at the sewing machine, and I've sewn the first 1/2 inch seam line from the top edge, 1/2 inch from the top edge down, like that. And now I need to sew the next seam line to make a 1 1/4 inch casing. So the way I'm going to do that, if you can mark tape on your sewing machine, that works great. I also just like the old trick of using a seam gauge to go as you sew. And so on that, I'm going to basically start my machine and get going. I'm going to look and say, okay, that's about where I need to be. Great. I'm going to sew across. Then I'm going to move down here and go, okay, where do I need to be? There I am. And I'm just going to sew across using my seam gauge like this. This is good when you have like longer seam allowances or seams. An old-fashioned seam gauge is pretty great for this. And so now I've just sewn all the way around on that, and I have essentially 2 lines, 2 sewing lines now. I have one 1/2 inch down and one 1 3/4 inch down. The next thing we need to do is we need to open up this casing. And the way we're going to do that is we have the 2 seam lines here, and we're just going to take a seam ripper and we are going to just open up the stitches in that side seam. And you just basically start pulling a thread like that, and one at a time, you just open them up like that. And you're going to do that on both sides. And you do it just between the two lines that you just stitched. And you can tuck in the little loose threads in there, or you can also use tweezers or scissors to kind of get them out so that they don't make a mess. There, I'm going to need to trim that actually, like that. I can trim that one. Great. We're going to do it on this side, and then we're going to flip it around, and we're going to do it on the other side. And this is what is going to give us our opening for our tapestry rod. And when you do that, just make sure with your seam ripper that you can always, you only want to be picking up the actual seam like that. You don't want to be getting any of the fabric. You don't want to cut the fabric. You just want to release those threads. This is a technique that I learned in Greece, and I really liked it. It's really simple. It's an easy way to make a casing. Normally in a lot of sewing, we would be really concerned about that not really being finished there. But on something like an embroidery like this, it's not going to be worn. It's not going to be taking a lot of heavy usage. So it isn't as much of a concern. And so once we basically have that done, we are going to take our tapestry rod, and one end comes off like that. And we will now just insert the tapestry rod into that casing like this and feed it across like that. Now when I get down to this, to keep the tapestry rod from hitting the folded under seam allowance, I just kind of put my finger in there to help guide it. And now we have the tapestry rod on like this, and in the next step, we'll put the braided cord on. So I have my casing made and my tapestry rod is inserted into it. You can see the rest of the wall hanging here. And the last step is to make the braided cord. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to take three 2-yard lengths of embroidery floss. I'm going to fold them in half, and I'm going to put a slip knot in them like that. Slip knot like that. I'm going to then take that slip knot and I am going to put it on one end of the tapestry rod like this, on around one finial, and I'm going to snug it up like this. Then I'm going to take this and turn it, and I'm going to start braiding it. What I'm going to do then, now I have 6 strands because I took 3 2-yard lengths and I folded them in half. So now I have, whoops, there we go. Now I have 6 strands, and I'm going to actually just start braiding them. I'm going to separate them into 2 strands, 2-strand sections, 3 2-strand sections, and I am going to just start braiding them like that. Just keep braiding, one over the other, one over the other. And I'm going to keep doing that until the braided cord is actually the length that I want to hang this. When I have my braided cord the length that I want, and that I usually just eyeball, I just look at it and go, yep, that looks about right. Then what I'm going to do on this end over here is I'm going to bring my 6 strands back together, separate them into 3, and then I will tie these around the other finial. Now, when you do this, the one thing you really want to make sure you do, I've learned the hard way, is you want to make sure that you put the knot at the back of the embroidery. So you're just going to tie a knot like that, and I do a quick spot check and go, okay, what's that going to look like when I have it actually laying there? And I'm like, okay, that's a good position for the knot. I might want it a little bit higher, and then I just put a second knot in there, so I'm creating a square knot, and that is my braided cord, and then I trim it like this. And then I have my fantastic wall hanging that looks like this. And now I can go hang it up and enjoy it. Here is my finished wall hanging with braided cord and tapestry rod. And it is fully lined on the back and is a wonderful piece of textile art that I get to go enjoy in my home. Here is my finished wall hanging with braided cord and tapestry rod. And it is fully lined on the back and is a wonderful piece of textile art that I get to go enjoy in my home.